Hello, everyone, my dear followers. Welcome to Chapter 15 of this fanfic that has been with us on the channel for so long. If you haven't seen the previous installments, you can find them in a playlist on the channel. Without further ado, enjoy.
Hozuki Castle, Kusagakyur. The weather outside was very uncharacteristic for a night out on the nearly plains country of the land of grass. With thunder rumbling and lightning flashing, it made for quite the unsettling scene for those scared of storms. And up in the retaining, isolating walls of the blood prison sat its warden, who was currently spending the night up in his study, behind his desk with his gloved hands placed together under his chin, eyes peering through the window into the night sky. It took just one glance into those soulless eyes of the warden, Mui, to see that he was a man who didn't have much to live for, but that was only a first glance. A second look revealed a man with much more of a drive. Currently it was that man who was reliving a happier time in his life. A time where his wife was very much alive and in fact pregnant with their son, who was soon to be born, making him a happy father. Then, much like everything in his life, there was complications, and his wife's organs started to fail after delivering their child, and with a normal medic there was nothing anyone could do to save her. At first he blamed his wife for not being strong enough to welcome their child into this world, but that was his initial reaction in his deepest grief. After a few weeks of searching within himself, the now father had come to the conclusion that it was indeed his son who was the one to blame for this. It was his burden that destroyed their family before it could start, so to atone for this, Mui set out to make sure his son, Muku, became as strong as he could possibly be so that he could make his wife's dream of a perfect Kusa a reality. There was only one way to do that, and that was with a chakra powerful enough to open up the box of ultimate bliss. It was a box meant to grant wishes, making the impossible possible. With the benefit of hindsight, the master of the infamous blood prison came to realize that too was a mistake, one of many he had made. His first mistake came in assigning blame because it was indeed his fault for not finding a medic Neen that could save his wife. His second mistake was offering his son to that box because all it did was take him away, and his third mistake was believing in this polluted world. But now he had his own vision for the power of the box, and this was a wish that he had kept from the rest of his flower group in the prison. We know where the box is since we held onto it after our first failure, but the truly difficult part of this whole thing is finding someone with powerful enough chakra that we can use to open up the box of ultimate bliss with. But the only thing I can think of is a Jinchuriki, but what village in their right mind would hand over such an asset? To even think about something like that, it would take not only an inexperienced leader, but also for the Jinchuriki to attempt to murder their leader. Thinking about it for a few moments, he shook his head. All the current Kages were much too tested to fall into a decision like that. Barely able to stifle the frustrated growl tearing through his throat, the man with long hair stood up and slammed both of his large, gloved hands on the top of his desk, causing the wood and his hands to create a loud slap that rung out sharply in the room, with only the storm outside providing any noise. Mui took a calming breath that stopped the light tremble in his shoulders before he slowly moved his hand to tuck some hair behind his ear and out of his face when there was a knocking at the door. "What?" He all but snapped at the door as his eyes glared into the dark, hoping that his piercing anger would somehow reach the person that was on the other side of the door. Mui remembered specifically stating that he was not to be bothered tonight, so whoever this was who was explicitly going against his word was going to be getting fired and then having the Tenro, heavenly prison, mark bestowed upon them. "Yes, sir. We have a report from one of the teams that was assigned to sweeping through the fields around the prison's island, and we actually came upon someone. They recognized him as Naruto Uchiha, sir. What do you want us to do?" It was no surprise that the masculine voice on the other end trembled on occasion out of fear. Hearing this caused the man's eyes to go wide for a number of reasons, the first being the magnitude of the capture his forces just made, and the second being that Naruto Uchiha was also an Uzumaki, the shinobi bloodline with the strongest chakras known to the world. Surely, if there was any kind of person outside of a Jinchuriki that could open the box, it was an Uzumaki. Calming himself down from overreacting to his silver platter presented opportunity, the warden of the prison cleared his throat before speaking up. "Very well done. I want you to keep him in a cell with chakra restraints on until the morning, where he will be processed in along with the rest of the daily filth that comes to our illustrious prison." He waited until he got the traditional "yes, sir," which was quickly followed by the hurried sound of feet rushing down the hallway to relay his orders to those beneath that officer. Now that he was sure he was alone, Mui allowed for a very pleased smile to cross his facial features as he gazed at the picture of his son's stoic face framed in a lasting picture on his desk. "Soon, my son. Soon you will return, and we can become the happy family that we were always meant to be. Even without an audience to hear him, the passion in his voice was real for the few moments that he could be heard before a rumble of thunder rained across the area, drowning out any other noises. Oh ho! Not so tough are you? So much for the feared and powerful Uchiha clan. If you ask me, I'd say you're nothing more than a lousy cur. Naruto by this point had tuned out the incessant chatter that was coming from the rotund man with the bad haircut and sunglasses who was hiding behind the other guards who were escorting him. It had started from the very moment he was forced from his cell, and only 3 minutes into the walk and the imprisoned Uchiha was already sick of it, but sadly he was unable to do anything about it. Being pushed through the doorway, Naruto's blue eyes fell upon a line of people in a similar position to the one he was in. The only difference being was that they were indeed in line. Feeling a baton being pressed into the back of his neck, Naruto sighed under his breath and allowed himself to be guided towards the end of the line, where he just closed his eyes and waited for something to happen. And nothing did for a handful of minutes, causing a few of the prisoners to get a bit antsy. What a childish tactic, Naruto muttered in thought. Everyone's eyes, sans Naruto's, turned to a pair of doors that slowly opened up at the top of a flight of stairs. There were a various amount of different reactions on the faces of those lined up as they watched the warden of the jail descend the stairs with his stoic expression in play. Mui's eyes momentarily kept on Naruto's frame before his dead gaze wandered across the rest in line, causing many of them to straighten up upon being examined. All of you are here for the worst reasons, murder, treason, and rape being a few of those reasons. Your villages have decided to wash themselves clean of your sins by sending you here to Hozuki Castle, which will be your home for the rest of eternity. There is no escape, and those foolish enough to try will die. He was more than pleased seeing a number of inmates stiffening with fear, which would help promote obedience, thus creating fewer headaches for him in the future. He was ready to turn around when there was a scoff that came from someone in the middle of the line. Spinning around with a glare in place, Mui's gaze steadied itself on a bald man formerly of the Hidden Mist, who seemed less than impressed by the whole spiel that was given. I see that you don't believe me. That is good. Why? It is good because now I can make an example of you. Moving until his shadow lingered over the shorter man, Mui slowly lifted his hand, and without so much as a shred of emotion flashing across his face, the warden delivered a flat palm strike to the man's chest. Katan Tenro. Fire release. Heavenly prison. The whole crowd watched in horror as a red seal appeared on the man's chest before it started to glow, causing the man who was previously defiant to gasp and grasp at his chest before crumbling to the ground, clawing at his chest. Oh God, it burns, it burns. Please make it stop. Anyone please. Ack. Turning around with a smirk on his face, Mui ignored the pain screams of the man who could feel his skin being burnt off his bones as he continued his speech. What you all just saw is the imprisonment jutsu that has been passed down in my family for ages. The Tenro is a jutsu that stops wars because it stops chakra. Anyone who either tries to access the chakra inside of them or leave the prison will be set on fire by the activation of the seal. A seal that will be placed on every single one of you. Mui looked to Naruto to see what kind of impression his little display had made on the person of importance to his plans, but found that he was quickly frowning when he saw that the raven-haired Uzumaki wasn't even looking. His eyes were still closed. Yes, then there is you, Naruto Uchiha, the shinobi that had suddenly vanished over the past few years. I am sure that the Hidden Leaf will pay a nice price for you. First, I will place something of an insurance policy on you, the Tenro. Yet another smirk crossed his face when Mui saw the momentary wince that crossed across Naruto's face when the initial burning sensation that came with the application of the seal was registered by his nerves. Now you are no better than anyone else here. Those famous ancestors of yours, that family of yours, and those eyes of yours. None of them will be able to help you here. Turning around, the warden proceeded to set the imprisonment technique on those who had yet to receive the seal. One by one, the man slowly destroyed the hopes of man after man with a simple tap of his hand. Now then, every single one of you will be put through screening, where we will be removing all of your dangerous weapons before you will be allowed with the rest of the prisoners. You will be receiving the prison's general schedule while being screened. Other than that, enjoy your stay at our lovely home. And with that simple dismissal, Mui was already on his way back to the same entrance that he came through, leaving the new batch of prisoners to the whims of his guards. I dare you to say that again, shrimp, bellowed out a large man with clothing on that was clearly too small for someone as large and rounded as he was. judging from the way that the veins bulging from the sides of his shaved head were being exposed out as he yelled. It was safe to say that he was very close to a boiling point. Standing in front of the angry giant was a man of modest height, but where he found himself lacking was in the department of weight, as he was quite the wiry, scrawny individual, and not because of his dieting. It was a simple byproduct of his genetic frame. Currently, that thin brunette man was snarling up at his roadblock. "I said get out of the way, Butterball, I'm trying to get something to eat. You know the thing you like to do a lot. That's it, I am going to crush you and your bones." Quickly the larger, bald man reached out and took the other prisoner by the collar of his shirt and yanked him off his feet, held right in front of him. His other arm could be seen lifting with a clenched, cocked fist ready to be delivered. The thin man, despite his unfavorable position, did not take this lying down. In fact, he looked ready to head but the larger man in the chin in order to get free of his clutches. Then, just as it seemed like blows were about to be traded, a handful of guards, each wielding correctional weapons, swarmed the two and the small audience, jeering them on. "Stop this instantly. Mui-sama will not have this kind of behavior here in his prison," the head guard of the group shouted, and then, without even waiting, he smashed his baton into the larger man's elbow, causing the nerves in it to fire off with pain, thus leaving the larger prisoner to drop his captive unceremoniously to the hard earth below. Looking at the guards behind him, the lead ordered them to separate the two, whilst those in the small encounter took verbal shots at each other until both were out of ear's reach of the other, despite the amount of blows they got in return for being so obstinate. Without a main event to watch, the crowd quickly dispersed to do other things, grumbling about the guards ruining the fun before it could even be started, and eventually the courtyard returned to its standard but still busy state of being. In that courtyard, off to the side, one Naruto Uchiha could be seen sitting cross-legged with his back to a column, watching the entire spectacle unfold with his cool, blue eyes showing no noticeable emotion. There were more than a few people who up to this point had approached him with insults about either how pathetic he looked or how they were so glad that the rest of his clan had been wiped out, but the raven-haired shinobi was more than able to ignore such things while giving anyone who approached a 1,000-yard stare that eventually got under their skin and drove them off. Before Naruto could start to think on how to spend his time here before the box of ultimate bliss would appear, he felt a presence come from out of the hall that was behind him, causing Naruto to turn his eyes momentarily to the left, where the presence stopped to lean against the inside of the pillar to his left. Arms crossing over her chest, the woman took rotating turns and glancing at Naruto and the courtyard, leaving Naruto to turn his attention back to where it was before, or at least until his newfound company decided it was time to speak up. The woman standing next to him was dressed in a green kimono top with a black shirt underneath it and matching trousers and shinobi sandals. Her white hair, while mostly contained by the green bandana she was wearing, did fall over her face, slightly covering one of her unique white eyes. She was a taller woman with tan skin and held a confidence about her. A confidence that went from her posture all the way to the strength of her gaze. "Tell me, Uchiha-san, why someone of your stature is here of all places?" Her voice was soft but still held his attention nonetheless. Her wording was blunt and clear enough to Naruto, something that once again he found refreshing considering the world they were living in, but still he wasn't going to just spill the reasons he had for being incarcerated here in Hozuki Castle just because she was being forward with him. "What do you mean? Haven't you heard? Because it is just as the stories say. I got careless and fell asleep a bit too close to this place, leaving me vulnerable to a passing patrol that scooped me up as I enjoyed my rest." He did try to keep his voice as genuine as he could for the sake of his cover, but found that comparing himself to a genin in the same way that he'd fall asleep like that to be sickening down to the depths of his stomach. After all, he was an Uchiha, and every Uchiha had their pride. Taking a glance back at the woman beside him, it was clear that she was not there with the rest of his group earlier in the morning, so that brought up the question of how exactly she knew who he was, especially after his absence from the world, given he didn't really change all that much appearance-wise except from height and muscle growth. "Please don't take me for a fool like the rest of the men you have fooled here. I know that someone who was skilled enough to defeat an out-of-control Jinchuriki years ago is not foolish enough to be caught like some fresh-from-school genin." Her words about his past put Naruto on alert. Not only did she know about what he had done, which many knew about, so it wasn't that big of a deal, she was also able to identify him and hide her presence from his ordinary senses long enough so that she could get in close to him. If he had to guess, he would say at least a Jounin-level kunoichi. "You are quite the perceptive one, but before I go into any possible reason for being here, why don't you share your name with me, Kunoichi-san? Oh, and don't bother trying to tell me you are male, because one look at your face and the bone structure of it is a very big giveaway for anyone with anatomical knowledge." It was childish and he knew it, But still Naruto couldn't help but find amusement in the few moments that the white-haired kunoichi had lost her composure and gawked at him, causing Naruto to chuckle. A few moments later and the woman coughed into her bandaged hand, bandages that ran all the way up to her elbows. Once she had fully regained her composure, the woman narrowed her eyes on the man in front of her. You may be able to determine my gender from a look, but do you care to explain how you can accurately claim that I am a kunoichi as well? Naruto took a glance at her before standing up and turning his body so that, much like his company for the moment, that it was leaning against the inside of the large, white column, leaving the unnamed woman firmly set in his gaze. Well, to start, you were able to identify me quite easily in the span of a few hours of me arriving. Now, normally this wouldn't be too large of a point except for two things. One, you were not in the group of prisoners that I arrived with, and there is also the fact that I haven't really been seen by anyone in years, so my description is a bit out of date. Plus, you also hid your presence long enough to get close to me, a sign of shinobi training. However, enough of that. I am going to ask that you stop stalling before you find yourself with an enemy that you do not want here in this place. She looked at him, running through the points he had made in her head, and after she had gotten done doing so, she had to silently curse herself for her need to confirm her information along with her instinct to be stealthily. It was only natural thanks to the training she had undergone, but this time it had clearly gotten her caught by this man in front of her because he was smart enough to know what he was looking for. My name is Ryuzetsu, and I am a kunoichi acting under the orders of the Land of Grass Fruit Group, a group that is in direct opposition to the flower group that Mui and the elders of the prison here belong to. It was a risk to reveal herself to Naruto, that much was certain, but she was certain that gaining the raven-haired man's trust would be quite beneficial to her plans. Naruto looked at her for a few moments before nodding in acceptance towards the information that he was just given. It wasn't as widely known about or as talked about as the civil war in the Land of Water, but Kusugakure did indeed have its own internal strife, and this conflict came in the form of small-scale battles and espionage between the flower and fruit groups, respectively. Naruto himself, while aware of the conflict itself, was not so aware of the situation to say what the goals of each group was, but if he had to guess, he'd say one wanted domination while the other coexistence. That seemed to be the norm for ideals nowadays. Meanwhile, as Naruto went through his own database in his brain, Ryuzetsu was looking at the space just over Naruto's shoulder, clearly going back and forth about what she wanted to say next, if she wanted to add something more. Letting this information out would let out more chances for a leak, she knew that, but if she could convince Naruto Uchiha to choose her side in this matter, it would make a strong ally for the kunoichi one she'd rather not see as a foe for this mission. I'm here because our group has uncovered Mui's plans to do something here in this prison that could ultimately be the end of this world. He wants to open something that will only cause pain, misery, and catastrophe. He wants to open the box of ultimate bliss in hopes that this box will be able to grant him any wish. Naruto ended up finishing Ryuzetsu's sentence for her without much thought of what he was actually doing, unaware of what kind of reaction it would stir up in Ryuzetsu. At first, Ryuzetsu didn't seem to have any kind of reaction, but once that moment passed, the white-haired ANBU operative took sneaking glances around them to make sure no one was looking, and once she confirmed that there weren't any eyes on them, she took Naruto by the collar of his black trench coat. Pulling him back into the shade and cover of the hall, she slammed Naruto back into the column, standing very close to him, glaring daggers into his still cool blue eyes. Why do you know about the box of ultimate bliss? Are you here to help them in opening the box? It would make sense, since why else would anyone as clearly skilled as you are want to come here to this hell willingly? In the heat of the moment, with her angering clouding her better judgment, Ryuzetsu had no problems with throwing her accusations in Naruto's face. The trembling in her shoulders was quite clear as her grip tightened on his trench coat. Naruto, to his credit, was able to keep his calm while he rode out the wave of emotional outrage that he was being subjected to. Once it was clear that she was not going to let go, Naruto supposed it was up to him to take matters into his own hands. Reaching up, he wrapped a hand around her left wrist and put enough pressure on the inside of her wrist with enough force that it slowly started to hurt physically. Naruto was all too aware of why Ryuzetsu was reacting like this and what was the reason behind this behavior, but even with all of that knowledge, he still wasn't going to allow himself to be treated like this. I am sure that you have a lot invested in this mission, but if you don't release me, you will find just how terrible of an enemy that I can be. Now, please. It was clear that despite how calm he tried to remain, that there was a growing indication of annoyance spreading through his voice. Thankfully for Ryuzetsu, she was skilled enough of a kunoichi to be able to pick up on the subtle shifting of Naruto's tone to tell that perhaps her rash lashing out at him may have done more harm than good in her sudden questioning. Taking a calming breath that stopped the slight, angry tremor in her shoulders, Ryuzetsu's fingers slowly uncurled, releasing Naruto's coat from her grip. Moving a step back, Ryuzetsu gave Naruto one last apologetic look before she nodded, letting Naruto know that she was now calmed down. Pushing off of the column, he was pressed into first. The raven-haired Uzumaki straightened out the few wrinkles near the collar of his coat before he straightened out his posture, leaving him a few inches taller than Ryuzetsu herself. Sighing, Naruto used the back of his hand to brush some hair from his face so that he had a clear view of grass kunoichi. Now then, as I was going to explain to you before you so rudely gripped my coat, I had learned about the box of ultimate bliss from the boss summon that my summon animals answer to. He advised me that I should try to stop the resurgence of the Satori, since he knows of the evil that something like that could spread across the land to leave it fester. Ryuzetsu had to rein herself in from actually vocally scoffing at the thought of one shinobi alone, no matter who they were, fighting and coming out victorious over such an infamous creature like the one known as an avatar of enlightenment. You actually think that you could fight something as powerful as the Satori alone? Something that almost alone brought ruin to the world? I hate to say this, but it appears that even you are vulnerable to the curse of the Uchiha pride. Rather than look offended by her mention of his personality, Naruto looked at her with a slight hint of amusement in his gaze. Before answering, Naruto chuckled and gave what could be called at best an indifferent shrug. Perhaps I am aiming too high, and yes, you and others could see that as arrogance on my part, but I am also part Uzumaki, which means I have one thing going for me than my past kinsman didn't, and that my fellow jailbird is Fuinjutsu. Naruto was not so blind as to not realize how people thought of the Uchiha, but unlike those, say, like Sasuke, he was not bothered by people mentioning his arrogance. If anything, it made them underestimate him. A fatal mistake for any shinobi. To be honest, Naruto had been expecting a retort from the white-haired kunoichi, and when all he received was silence and a look that said she would require further elaboration, Naruto decided that it would be all right for him to let her in on his little plan. As far as I see, to release the monster you need to open the box, and when they do that, I am sure that this creature won't be as friendly as they think. They never are. Anyways, with the chaos that will ensue, I can not only seal the monster back into the box, but this time I can seal the box way entirely, not simply burying it like the last time. That is your plan? That can hardly even be called a plan. Everything you just said revolves around chance and things falling in your favor. There is no certainty in this. Ryuzetsu immediately disputed the plan because her shinobi training required that whenever she'd undertake something like this, she required something concrete that she could count on, and not something that could change as easily the direction of which the wind blows. However, if she was going to comment on one thing that seemed to be a positive out all of this, it was the fact that he was very confident about it all. If Naruto was bothered by her opinion of his plan, he did not show it, as his face kept decidedly neutral despite the disbelief that was dripping from her words. In fact, her doubting of his plans seemed to light a fire inside of those chilled, blue eyes of the Uchiha. Yes, I will admit that this will take some things falling in the right direction, but the end result is the most effective in dealing with this wish-granting box for good, and that can't be denied. There were few things even in the world of shinobi that could rival the strength and danger of an Uzumaki clan-styled sealing technique, which was the very reason that nearly all of the clan from the Whirling Tides had been wiped out by the combined forces of Iwagakure, Kumogakure, and Kirigakure back before the last Great War. That fact was something that, still saddening for Naruto, provided him with the advantage, because even as an Uzumaki, people underestimated that blood, since very few people believed that practitioners so skilled in Fuinjutsu even existed outside of those who had decades of experience, something Naruto was not above exploiting. Now, if you'll excuse me, Ryuzetsu, I must be going. Being gone too long in a place like this will raise suspicion. I wish you good luck in whatever you plan on doing. With his piece said, Naruto folded his arms across his chest and gave Ryuzetsu a respectful nod before stepping back around the column and back into the courtyard, where the shinobi from the Land of Fire hence made his way forth towards the mess hall, easily ignoring the few jeers that were thrown his way by disgruntled prisoners on both sides. Meanwhile, left alone to her thoughts, Ryuzetsu stood there in silence, her eyes still trained on the spot that Naruto was occupying. It was one thing to believe your abilities when it was just your life at stake, but the way that Naruto was willing to risk everyone here and then some left Ryuzetsu uneasy about the battle that could happen. It won't matter because I will succeed and Mui will fall, and with him all of their plans too will crumble. A few nights later, once again night had fallen over the world, shrouding it in the darkness, which to each and every prisoner was a welcomed reprieve from the intensive labor and all too frequent brawls. Night was a time for rest and recuperation. However, where some took it as an escape from the realities of where they were, there were others who took this time of peace to think. Those thoughts ranged anywhere from those left behind to revenge on those who placed them here in the blood prison in the first place. Yet most of these thoughts ended up taking place behind the isolation that the bars of each cell provided, the security of servitude and condemnation. However, that was not the case for Ryuzetsu, who was standing out on a cliff side, her white eyes staring down intently at the violent, swirling riptide of water that was below her. Having been in this prison long enough, Ryuzetsu knew that the strong undercurrents around the island paired with the Tenro seal was all that was needed to keep its perfect record intact, because when nature is against you and hope is removed, there is no one that would even dare trying to attempt such a foolish thing. The pain of the seal shutting down any shinobi's ability to survive and removing the one thing that shinobi relied on, chakra. Well, all that meant was death. The white-haired kunoichi belonging to the fruit group stood there atop of the precariously hanging landmass with her hand under her chin, and her face clearly taking the expression of thought as she mulled over all that had happened thus far over the past few nights. Was what that man said true? Can I trust him, considering that he was working for Mui, or at least with him? But he said he needed his trust, and doing his bidding from the inside was the only way to earn that trust. It was just too much to take in and try to go through in just one night, and currently Ryuzetsu was too busy trying to go through it all to be in the right mind to make any decision at the moment, and she knew that. Normally Ryuzetsu would take this time to think about her past and the number of personal tragedies that she had to go through that made her into the kunoichi that she was today, but not tonight. No, tonight she had to turn her attention towards the information she had gathered after her assassination attempt on the prison's warden. A failed assassination attempt, because if it was true, it changed a number of things happening here in the prison, and that change would be soon coming. Feeling the frustration building up within her, the kunoichi closed her eyes and took a deep breath, using the moment to force herself to calm down and to even her temperament. Scrunching your face up like that will give you a lot of wrinkles when you get older, Ryuzetsu. With the thoughts that were running around in her mind, she didn't know who to expect that voice to belong to. Mui, one of his guards, the man doing Mui's dirty work? Ryuzetsu turned around, her eyes wide in alarm, and without so much as a second thought, her preservation instinct kicked in as she threw a straight right hand towards whoever it was that made their way up behind it. It was only after it was too late to pull her fist back that she was able to decipher whose face it was that was hidden by the cover of night. Naruto. It wasn't quite a horrified look on her face, since it was just a punch, but it was indeed a panicked look on her face, as the last thing she wanted to do was harm her newfound acquaintance without reason, which she thought she had just done. But just before her fist could find its target, Naruto held his palm out, and instead of a dull thud of fist hitting face, there was the thud, Naruto catching Ryuzetsu's blow just inches from the bridge of his nose. The two of them stood there in silence for a few moments before Naruto's blue eyes drifted south to the fist he was holding, the action nearly causing him to go cross-eyed for a moment. Blinking once then twice, Naruto moved his eyes to the still slightly shaken ones of Ryuzetsu before the corners of his lips twitched into a wry, if not slightly amused grin. That was quite the greeting, Ryuzetsu. A good way to keep people on their toes, that much is for sure, Naruto said under a chuckle, clearly making light of the situation. Naruto, what are you doing here? Ryuzetsu asked, ignoring his attempt at humor, her voice still a bit shaky from the surprise lingering in her system. Since there wasn't supposed to be anyone outside of the prison ever, let alone at these hours, she thought it was a question that was rightfully asked. Before he even answered, Ryuzetsu could tell that something was off by the dry look of disbelief that she was receiving from Naruto, but even with a few moments of silence, she still couldn't come up with a reason as to why he was giving her that kind of look. I snuck out here after leaving a clone sleeping in the cell. For being such a large, impenetrable prison, the security is pretty lax, but what are you doing here? Naruto asked, making sure to emphasize the point that no one should be out here, which included her, leaving him hoping she understood. In Ryuzetsu's defense, she had been here for so long, much longer than Naruto, that coming out here to be alone had become close to second nature, so much so that her mind had associated this with not breaking the rules. Back during my times in actual combat, I was used more for sabotage and espionage than doing the same sort of thing in a controlled environment like this is easy. The white-haired Kunoichi replied with a slight shrug as Naruto released her fist, allowing her to turn back to face the sea ahead, leaving Naruto to do the same as he stood beside her with his hands folded against his back. Uncharacteristically, it was Naruto who broke the silence between the two. Just going by the look on your face, something happened that has seemed to put some doubt in the back of your mind. Do you feel like sharing whatever your problem is? Naruto wasn't one who normally went out of his way to ask things like that, but maybe it was because in this prison there was only one person he could really talk to semi-openly? That's what he was going to go with, since it made sense with his human need for social interaction. Silence was his answer, or at least it was for the time that it took Ryuzetsu to decide if she wanted to tell him or if she wanted to remain tight-lipped and silent about it. A minute later, Ryuzetsu let a sigh leave past her lips and decided to tell Naruto what had happened. The other night I planned on assassinating Mui in his sleep, but things didn't go as planned. She could see Naruto's body slightly tense up in what she guessed was a precautionary defense, but she didn't say anything, or even visibly react to it. Then it is safe to assume that was your plan. Not a bad one, but then again, it didn't have much creativity to it. Despite the fact that it was a clear insult, Ryuzetsu, strangely enough, didn't feel too offended by the slight at her plan. Maybe it was the even tone that he said it with, or the fact that there wasn't a pair of eyes that she could see clearly judging her, as both were still looking out into the elemental sea. I do have a question of my own, however. If you failed to assassinate the warden of this jail, then how exactly are you moving around so freely, and say not laying in the morgue somewhere? And there was the question that she was hoping not to hear but expecting at the same exact time. Not that either of those made her any more willing to answer. As Ryuzetsu tried to come to a decision about her response, the silence stretched on for a period of time longer than she was even aware of. In that time, Naruto had seemed to pick up on her indecision and spoke up on the hunch he had. Something happened. Something that you aren't sure that you can trust me with, which is why you're hesitating. Natural and thus expected. This time the Uzumaki's words were enough to provoke Ryuzetsu into turning around and staring into the side of Naruto's face with a look of suspicion plastered on her face. After all, who was really okay with being left out of the loop? No, I am not reading your mind, Ryuzetsu. Well, not your mind specifically. Any one of us, from the most benevolent of Kage or the most infamous missing Nin, we have certain factors that make us human. We search for trust, acceptance, social interaction, and dreams. Those are a few things that keep every one of us ticking and driving. Even the most deranged madmen carry at least one of those physiological needs. This insight into the basic working as their species as humans, while simple and easy to decipher, only further strengthened the belief that Ryuzetsu held that Naruto Uzumaki, or Naruto Uchiha, no matter what name he was called, was still a dangerous man even without the arsenal of bloodline powers he had at his disposal. It was a terrifying prospect if you were considering him to be an enemy, and something to be admired and fought for if he was an ally. It was a polarizing kind of power, a natural charisma and way of thought that could change things around him from simply existing, much like stories and documents written about Madara Uchiha that she had studied growing up as a child. As the two stood there under the darkened sky, with the only real source of light being the smooth beams of light coming off of the moon, it seemed like silence would be the order of the night, at least until Ryuzetsu spoke up. Do you really think that you have a realistic chance of beating that monster? Even though she didn't specify what creature she was talking about, it was 100% implied that she was indeed referencing the Satori. To Naruto, it seemed like she was seeking out in him some kind of hope, an assurance that everything would end here in this prison. Ryuzetsu, you have some kind of previous experience with this subject. Probably not with the Satori personally, but that doesn't discount the box. Whenever you mention it, there is a fire in your eyes. It's a fire, an emotion much different than that of just doing what is right. It's personal for you. Is it revenge? His words, though deep prying, were kept soft and lenient, because even if he was curious for answers, he knew that this line of questioning was passing some personal boundaries and was by no means information he was entitled to. There was one thing about his questioning that was planned, however, and that was that it distracted her from her question, the question of victory. The white-haired woman held strong for a few moments before her whole demeanor slouched and a burdened sigh left from her lips. She had spent so much of her training, her life, bottling things up that it had become second nature, almost like a self-made instinct, but when Naruto pointed it out directly, it was like breaking the pillars used to support that strain on her, and it showed. Turning around, Ryuzetsu gestured for Naruto to follow her to the cave just behind them where there was a small fire burning inside. Each taking their respective seat on opposite sides of the controlled flames, it was Ryuzetsu who began. Growing up as a child in a wartime environment is tough. I won't say it is the worst of ways to grow up, but it provides its challenges. As a child, you are trusting, naive, and generally ignorant of the ways of the world around you. In the land of grass, though, it was different, not knowing who to be friends with because of how their parents and guardians were aligned with in the war. Who to trust, who you belong with, the things you just referenced. During her tale, Ryuzetsu hadn't taken her eyes off of the ever-changing swirls and wisps of fire. Speaking each word as it came, in Naruto was by no means going to ignore her need for an open floor, so to say. Fearing for my safety, my parents decided that they couldn't risk me being a normal child and taught me as much as I could learn at such a young age about the importance of being cautious and tight-lipped. And being young, I complied, not wanting to disappoint them. Yet, after a few months, I was tired of being alone and tried to make friends. One of those friends was a boy named Muku. He was so ambitious, always telling how he wanted to make the land of grass a stable place. A peaceful place that I guess it finally rubbed off on me. As his friend, I wanted his dream to become a reality. She continued, her tone getting lower and sadder by each word. Muku. He trained so hard to make sure that he had the strength to complete his dream despite being so young. It took some time, but finally he was able to have that chance to make his dream come true. Came in the form of the box of ultimate bliss. They hoped by using the box and its wish-granting powers that they could save our homeland, but then the fairy tale turned into a nightmare and the box devoured him before locking up. I lost my only true friend and to some stupid box. That's why I want the box gone forever. Then and only then will true peace be established and his dream will come true. By the end of her emotional outburst, the young woman was left panting and slightly flustered in the face, looking to Naruto for some form of validation, but to her shock and outrage, all he did was shake his head. You are already losing your way. His words were measured and quiet, but aside from the crackling of the fire and her own ragged breath, there was nothing that could prevent her from hearing those words. Her passion quickly changed to anger, and it was solely directed at the man in front of her. What did you say? She all but hissed out as she prepared to willingly strike out at Naruto for daring to make light of her burden, of her misery. You have lost your identity, Ryuzetsu, that is what. You longed for acceptance, and when that came you latched to the ideals of the person who accepted you and started fighting on their behest for their vision. Even to this day you fight. But even now, as you defend your friend's dream, you couldn't find it in you to say my or our dream. No, you said his dream. Pass it off as a slip of the tongue if you wish to lie to yourself, but can you tell yourself that peace is what you truly want? Peace for the land of grass when you can't find peace for yourself? Your dream isn't to live for others who won't acknowledge you. You want something smaller, more intimate that you can cherish. Living for others is not the dream you want. His words at first were being instantly shut out by her ears, but as he continued to speak, she found herself more willing and more drawn into what he was saying, and he wasn't even trying to do it like some mad cultist. By the nature of his philosophy alone, he had captured her attention, but part of her still felt the need to defend herself, defend what she had been entrenched in for so long. What about the Kages and the various village leaders? Are their dreams for naught then as well? Were they lying to themselves? Shaking his head carefully, Naruto offered her a smile as he kept his gaze locked with hers, allowing her to see the clear belief in his words and respect for those he was just about to speak about. No, their dreams are just as much real as the everyday Chunin, for example. Men like Tobirama Senju and the Third Raikage who gave everything for their village had dreams. Their dreams were to actually be there for their people, but that is not a dream that everyone can live by every moment of every day. Tell me, Ryuzetsu, do you care about some shinobi in your camp that you have never met? Can you be empathetic with someone who clearly deserves what they have instead of treating them like something more? Despite being an Uchiha, Naruto was more than able to see the sacrifices men such as the second Hokage and third Raikage made, and was able to respect it because that was something special in their profession that very few thought about and even less performed. Sitting there, Naruto quickly realized she didn't have an answer. You don't even need to answer to me, Ryuzetsu, but you do have to answer your conscience. Remember that. Giving the contemplative Kunoichi one last nod, Naruto stood up and made his way back to the prison with something else on his mind that was not shared with Ryuzetsu. It wasn't anything that concerned him. It actually brought a devilish grin to his face as he walked away. Meanwhile, back in the cave, Ryuzetsu looked down to her upturned hands with a look of clear conflict on her face as she tried to combat the mental turmoil plaguing her. She desperately wanted for the side she was originally on to win, but the longer she sat there, the more Naruto's opinion on what dreams were crept into her thoughts. And for the first time in her adult life, Ryuzetsu had to think about what she truly wanted from this life she was given. What do I want? Hozuki Castle, Kusagakure. It had been a few nights and Naruto's routine had been nailed to a T up to this point in time in the prison. The days would start with him having to go out and perform some physical labor for a few hours before eating a barely passing breakfast. After that, it was free time for the prisoners who got their work done and those who had not went back to work. Being the kind of man he was, Naruto was usually always finished considering those who behaved like he did got the lesser extent of the work. Honestly, it was a much more forgiving prison that Naruto had initially expected, but after a day of thinking about that, Naruto realized that conditions were kept light so that deaths didn't happen on premise from shoddy conditions, something that would stain the prison's reputation. In truth, the real dangers or pitfalls of this prison came in the form of the less than chipper inmates who had no qualms with going around and picking fights. Naruto quickly came upon the realization that they didn't really care what kind of trouble they got in so long as they got some kind of blow or humiliation on those they despised, and naturally, being an Uchiha, most of the scum here hated Naruto for the gifts he was born into, which resulted in Naruto being provoked at nearly every moment. Not one to be too morbid about anyone's situation, the black-haired Uzumaki just took it as an exercise in tolerance. The nights in the blood prison, however, were much different. They were by far the most quiet, safe times there were to be had here, for the sole reason that everyone was locked inside of their cells. It didn't matter if they were plotting revenge or sleeping. They were locked away and incapable of anything. With that revelation, Naruto wasted no time in using the reprieve to get some shut-eye, which helped the teen operate better throughout the day at the prison. Not that it took all that much energy in the first place. So that's why Naruto could currently be found resting on the floor mat with his back to the cell door. The occasional flicker of candlelight cast a low shadow of the Uchiha's figure against the back wall of his cell in all its static glory. Or at least it did, until there was a quick break in the constant visage. A break that quickly vanished, leaving things back the way that they were. However, despite the clear fact that there was someone out there, the silence permeated, only being broken by the occasional sound from an audible insect or just the whipping winds swirling around the land. The prison laid on top of, leaving Naruto no reason to be bothered to wake up, since there was no danger to be sensed. Slowly, the cage door to Naruto's cell slowly slid open. Miraculously, the giant iron door didn't make a single sound as it slowly crept open, a fact Naruto remained oblivious to in his sleep. A moment later, the cloaked head of a shadowy figure peeked in from the side of the cell, staring clearly and firmly at Naruto's back for a few moments before the figure started to move into the cell. Each step was measured and careful so that he did not set off any alarms inside of Naruto's body and wake him up. That would make the job infinitely more difficult. Creeping towards the sleeping shinobi's positioning, the cloaked figure reached into his cloak, and from it, he pulled out a black blanket that he made sure to keep away from both of his mouth and nose so that the knockout toxin that'd release when it hit against another person's flesh, hence the gloves that he was keeping on. Sorry about this, Naruto-san. It's nothing personal, but sometimes when you are part of something that is bigger than yourself, people that you don't even know have to support your mission. I hope you'll understand. The voice from beneath the cloak was oddly apologetic as he reached down and knelt beside the sleeping shinobi before he threw the blanket over the top of Naruto's frame and held it tightly against Naruto's body, so that the only thing that he could inhale as he gasped out and started to thrash was the toxin that the blanket released upon coming against the oil of a human body's skin. The struggle lasted for a few moments before Naruto's body went slack, causing the man underneath of the cloak to grin victoriously. Easing the tension that went through his frame to keep Naruto restrained, the shrouded man slowly peeled the blanket back and shoved it back into the storage seal on the inside of his cloak. However, just before that, this cloaked operative could speak of his victory or ability to secure the objective, Naruto, or who he thought was Naruto, suddenly dispersed in a cloud of thick smoke that was quickly inhaled through the man's mouth, sending him reeling back in a coughing fit, his violent hacking slightly construed by the voice modulator inside of his cloak. Eventually, the smoke did clear and the man sat up, but the noticeable difference was that the man's hood fell off his head, exposing his face for the first time. The man's skin was tanned to go along with a head of short, messy brown hair that was kept short to keep out of the way while within the prison. His facial was an extremely thin beard that lightly scattered around his jawline. The elderly man's gray looked at the now vacant floor with a look of consternation before he sighed and rubbed at his forehead, shoulders slumping in clear agitation. Well, this sets things back a bit. The boss isn't going to be happy. Naruto, who had just stepped back into the premise of the compound when the shadow clone he left behind in the cell was dispelled, leaving him with a few pieces of information to sort through, considering that his clone wasn't quite asleep as the spy thought him to be. With a smirk gently pulling at one corner of his lips, Naruto paused for a brief moment before he silently sped through the corridor down back to his cell. Stopping in front of the door to his cell, the raven-haired shinobi chuckled softly at what he saw. Because the door that he had made sure was closed when he first left was now slightly opened and purposefully, so that if on the off chance that he wanted to say something about what happened this night, they'd have him explain why his cell was opened, considering that no one should be out of their blocks at this time. It made sure that any kind of explanation on his part would require him going over his reasons for breaking the protocol. Naruto personally was sure that they knew he was going to go about opening his mouth, but what he did find interesting was that even in the botched attempt to abduct him, they still managed to at least slightly cover their bases. Shaking off the light case of mirth that was spreading through his frame, Naruto deftly stepped into his cell and gently shut the door before he sat down in the center of his bed mat and started to meditate. A meditation that'd bring him into a nap. I didn't think that you'd move things along so quickly, Mui, but now you have played your first card and failed. What will you do next? Will it be amusing or will you force the issue? Either way, I look forward to your attempt. Naruto mumbled softly as he set his hands on the insides of his knees, keeping his posture upright as the signs of his breathing, the chest inhaling and exhaling and the shoulders rising and falling, started to even out as the Uchiha went into a semi-aware state that meditation would give him until he was roused from his slumber in the morning for his duty in the prison. He was more than attuned to dealing with not-so-open agendas and covert plots, but unlike the micro-focus of it just being on him, it was usually dealing with the politics of council back in Konoha, trying to manipulate their way into gaining his pair of cursed eyes. The only thing that was left for him to do this time was to sit and wait for his opponent's next play, much like a game of shogi. And that's what happened, boss. Marwa, the man that went into Naruto's cell, said with a slight sigh as he went about relaying what happened back inside of Naruto's cell block, and the reason that said Uzumaki was not currently down in the sub-basement on a table ready to provide all the energy that Mui and his cohorts could hope for. Staring at his warden but still his boss, Marwa could feel a bit of anxiety building in the pit of his stomach as he watched Mui holding the expression of what one could expect from a rock behind the bridge that his fingers had made just over his mouth. What made the look even worse was the fact that Mui's eyes were so cold, so lifeless, that it almost made it seem to Marwa that he wasn't even there in Mui's sight to begin with. He used a shadow clone to take his place. That is troubling because not only does that mean he managed to perform a jutsu with the Tenro seal on him, but he also managed to compromise the security of the prison. I should have expected that someone as skilled as Naruto Uchiha would cause some problems. Mui monologued to himself as he closed his eyes and let his hands drop back towards the desk that he was sitting behind. A silent form of anger but respect building for what the shinobi had managed to do. We should go and apprehend him and bring him down to the basement. We know what he did, we have proof. There's no denying that. Marwa offered his own thoughts on the matter after watching Mui seem to look like he was trying to figure out the correct manner of business, but to the aid of the warden everything seemed pretty black and white right now. Naruto broke the rules, they need him for their plans, so take him in and complete the plan. Eyes snapping open to stare firmly through his subordinate with a clear as day frown put on his face from listening to the suggestion offered. He wouldn't lie and say that the thought had crossed his mind, but irrational actions such as that could and would have a rippling consequence throughout the whole prison. If they heard what Naruto had managed to pull off, it would inspire others and cause problems in the future, something he was not interested in spreading right now. No. I'll make sure to wait until Naruto makes another mistake and I'll be right there ready for it. Frowning softly, Marwa wasn't quite sure that now was the time for passive tendencies, but he knew better than to openly question Mui less. He wanted to end on the floor writhing in pain at Mui's feet because he activated the imprisonment seal that ran across the chest of every inmate here, including him. So instead of blatantly questioning, he tried for something just a bit more subtle that he hoped to use to nudge Mui in the right direction. How do you know he'll be careless like this again? Then, for the first time in quite a while that Marwa had come to work for Mui, he saw the warden of the infamous blood prison smile, but his smile was not one that was ordinary. No, this was a smile that was full of not quite malice, but no, it was something more akin to a ruthless kind of aggression that nearly brought forth a frown to Marwa's face. In here, my mole, in my prison, no one is above making a mistake. I will know when he stumbles, and I'll be there to help him fall. Narrowing his eyes, Mui's expression fell back into a stone-cold stoicism before he gestured for Marwa to leave him. If that's all you needed to tell me, then leave my sight and get back into your cell. Bowing, Marwa didn't say a word as he turned around and walked towards the door, causing Mui to turn in his chair so that he could look out of his window. It was that change in direction that caused Mui to miss the slight second that Marwa turned over his shoulder and gave him a narrowed stare before opening the door and leaving, shutting the door behind him, leaving the warden prisoner to his thoughts. Hozuki Castle, a few days later. This work isn't something fit for an active shinobi, even if they are a prisoner. This is work for the sick and elderly. Naruto muttered to himself, quiet enough that even the prisoner just a row beside him coughing wasn't able to hear the frustration that boiled out. It had been 6 days since Naruto had sneaked out of the prison to find Ryuzetsu. On accident, of course. Then 3 days into those 6 days, he was moved to file duty, which in short was nothing more than lifting boxes and moving them around whenever a reordering was necessary. In short, the work was so mundane that even a shinobi like Naruto was slowly starting to lose his mind. Sensing a presence standing at the edge of his aisle, Naruto turned to look at who was just lingering there, and to his not dismay, there was the man responsible for handling him in this department, and in his hands was yet another box of files he clearly needed to be put back in place. Logically, it made sense that a place as active as the prison had lots of moving documents daily, but that knowledge didn't make Naruto feel any better about being stuck in this place. Clearly, from the taunting smirk that was on the man's face, Naruto's agitation must have been quite visible. Biting his tongue to make sure he didn't make a mistake, Naruto's cool blue eyes just drilled holes into the unperturbed man. Oh, don't worry, Uchiha-chan, you only have another 90 minutes of this for today. Maybe trying to find out where this goes will help you spend the rest of your time. If they were in the actual world and not the haven that this jail provided, Naruto surely would have taken his frustrations out on this man by beating the daylights out of the man until he had quite the number of broken bones, but here that wasn't possible, hence the blatant taunting. With the thrill of Naruto reacting being taken away, the man just huffed and walked away, leaving Naruto with a box that was unlabeled, which was almost enough for the Uzumaki side of his blood to flare and lash out with his temper. Almost 90 minutes later, marching his way quite stiffly out of the file center, Naruto's brow could be seen twitching ever so faintly to go along with a subtle vein bulging on his forehead. He did indeed spend the rest of his remaining shift having to go through the paperwork in the box, so he knew where it could be stored, and in the end Naruto was told by the other worker, who had been there much longer than Naruto, that the kind of papers in that box always went straight to the incinerator, which Naruto read silently as everything you have done was for no reason. Needless to say, Naruto was nearly on the verge of performing a fire jutsu to set the whole building ablaze, despite the fact that using too much chakra would set his body on fire thanks to the Tenro seal across his chest under his clothing. However, after taking a moment, Naruto remembered the mission he had been entrusted with by his summons, had refocused himself on the mission and on his discipline, and that's when he came walking out of the building. Sighing, Naruto ran his fingers through his hair, pushing the bang that fell over his eye out of the way so that he had complete vision out of both eyes instead of just one. Feeling his stomach rumbling a bit, Naruto took a glance down and chuckled softly at himself. Looks like I wasn't the only one who was annoyed about getting the short end of the stick. He mumbled to himself as he patted his stomach before shoving his hands and making his way through the courtyard to the mess hall to get himself whatever average meal had been dished out today. As he made his way to his destination, Naruto thought nothing of the 2 average men that were walking his way, since he knew they were the 2 that replaced his shift from having went by them for a few days now. That was his thought, at least until each of them bumped into one of his shoulders, causing Naruto to react on instinct and grab the insides of the elbows on the arms they used to bump into him before pushing them both back so they were in front of him in his glare. You have 3 seconds to apologize. His voice was dripping with annoyance. His body tensed like a cornered animal, only he was not cornered, he was irritated from working in what was essentially an office along with being hungry that right now he was just about ready to explode. The 2 men looked at Naruto, then at each other before they both started to laugh right in Naruto's face as his silent countdown hit 3. Shaking his head tauntingly, Naruto took a breath with a dangerous grin spreading across his features. Don't say I didn't give you a chance. Before they even had the chance to stop laughing, Naruto's left hand launched forward, gripping the man on the left by the wrist and pulling it down until there was a snap, which was quickly followed by a scream of agony that caused the laughter to stop, and for all the eyes in the immediate area, both guard and prisoner, to look over and find that no longer was the man's bone under his skin, but rather jutting out quite grotesquely as he writhed on the ground holding onto his arm. The man's friend, who was standing there beside him, stared down at his friend with wide, horrified eyes that could only watch the blood flow down his friend's arms, the bone ripping through the man's skin. After gaping at his friend for a few more moments, he looked to the man responsible for the situation, and that shock turned to outrage. "Who the fuck do you think you are? I'll kick your fucking ass," he roared as he rushed Naruto, his right fist cocked back, ready to deliver revenge for his friend. With a grin on his face, Naruto allowed for this man to rush him, ducking and weaving out of the way of the sloppy, dull strikes that the man was throwing his way. To Naruto, the difference between their respective skill sets, after was perhaps the fourth or maybe fifth combination, Naruto decided it was his turn to react. Waiting for the fool to overextend himself again, Naruto lashed out and kicked the man right in the gut with enough force for the man to lurch over before he was sent back a foot, crashing to the ground. "Come on. Didn't you want your revenge? You can't do it on the ground like a dog." Growling much like the dog he was called, the man clawed at the ground as chaos erupted around them in what quickly became a full-fledged riot, guards struggling to contain the pandemonium around them as the inmates went into a frenzy. Pushing off the ground, the man wasn't even fully to his feet before he made a wild rush towards Naruto, who was ready to be done with the last bits of irritation. Naruto waited till the man took the last possible step that he could take before he shifted to the left and stuck his foot out, causing the man to slide across the ground, cutting open the skin on his palms and chin. The black-haired Uzumaki didn't even bother letting the man get up a second time as he curb-stomped his head into the ground with a sigh of relief. "Yeah, I needed that," Naruto mused, looking at the unconscious man beneath his foot before his eyes wandered towards the man's whose wrist he broke, who was also unconscious from the pain shutting down his body. Cracking his neck, Naruto looked forward to see Mui walking towards him with his typical frown on his face. Glancing by him, Naruto found a few piles of prisoners who he was going to assume were dispatched by Mui, leaving the guards to do something with them. "You have been nothing but a problem since you have arrived, Naruto Uchiha. Even today, I know from the guards that you were the one who escalated and in turn incited a riot, something that must be punished," Mui declared sternly as he took a step forward, his posture dropping into a taijutsu stance, looking to Naruto like he was expecting him to do the same. Slowly lifting his foot from off of the man's head, Naruto gave the man a curious glance before his calm expression went a bit dark. It was an expression that, had Mui been any more unseasoned, that it might have caused him to pause. "And did you know that you and my parents would have gotten along famously? They thought I was quite the problem child as well. That, and I dislike you just about as much as I do them." Despite the noticeable increase in the amount of aggression in his voice, Naruto still did not initiate on Mui. "Then they were terrible as parents. I will take it upon myself to finally teach you meaning of discipline, since it was so clearly lost on you in your childhood," Mui muttered through a shake of his head before he raced forward, aiming a 1-2 combination towards Naruto's solar plexus. They were two strikes that Naruto managed to avoid, but to Naruto the difference between Mui and the two morons he fought earlier was painfully clear, a pain Naruto nearly felt. Shifting inward, Naruto used his hand to keep the dominant, extended arm of Mui at a distance, leaving with an opening that Naruto struck at, however. But before Naruto's fist could find its intended destination, Mui's large, gloved hand stopped him, and his other hand tapped Naruto's chest, directly letting out of a burst of chakra through his fingers. Mui activated the Tenro seal, causing Naruto to drop to his knees as the burning sensation spread through his body. Watching dispassionately as Naruto collapsed to the ground in pain, Mui straightened himself out and gave his clothing a gentle pat down, smoothing out the few creases born of moving in a combative fashion had created. Turning, he found a group of 3 guards standing there at attention, awaiting his orders. Glancing over his shoulder, the man wiped a strand of hair from his face before looking back at the guards and nodding. "Take him into solitary confinement and leave him there for 3 days. He must realize that he is not allowed to do as he pleases here in my jail." "Hi, sir," all 3 chorused together while raising their hands and saluting to the man in charge before moving around him and hoisting Naruto up, one taking him by the arms and then each of the other 2 taking a leg, ignoring his groaning in pain as they moved through the much more subdued courtyard for those who didn't partake in the brawl to watch what was happening, each with a different reaction, which consisted of amusement all the way down to bewilderment. One of those innocent bystanders being Ryuzetsu, who, when she saw Naruto being hauled off to be holed up in solitary confinement, shut off from the rest of the world hand to question his motives, which could be seen on her face from the way her brows furrowed and her skin tightened up. Watching Naruto's body disappear, just turning out of her line of sight, her white eyes narrowed questioningly. Just what is he doing? Just what are you doing? Naruto was interrupted from what it was he doing by the deep, unmistakable voice of his resident chakra monster, causing the Uchiha to open his eyes and blink as he found himself inside of his mindscape staring into the slitted, dangerous eyes of the ever-power Kyuubi, or at least the conscious and power that he had been gaining throughout the years. Just looking into the face of the Kyuubi from where he was sitting up in a tree branch with the kitsune resting on the top of his hill, Naruto couldn't help but grin. Well, aren't you a sight for sore eyes? You know, I was starting to think that this Tenro seal was messing with your ability to communicate with me from the amount of silence I was getting, Naruto admitted with a chuckle directed to the way that the Kyuubi's brow twitched when he realized that his power was being subtly questioned, even though both knew it wasn't subtle in any fashion after all they had been together for years now. They never once had defined what their relationship was, since it wasn't something that ever needed to be discussed with the give and take mutual nature to their agreement. Silence, you idiot! If a seal that is meant to not only split my power in two but also keep my mind away from that power can't keep me weak, what makes you that a pathetic chakra restraint would do anything? The Kyuubi howled, wasting no time in making sure that Naruto remembered just how powerful he was, even if he only had 7 tails at this point. His crimson eyes glaring murderously at Naruto as if he was issuing a silent dare for him to say otherwise. But Naruto did the opposite in the way that he reeled back so he was slouched against the trunk of the tree as he laughed, huffing for air. Naruto playfully wiped just under his eye with his finger like he was crying before he sat back up and shot a grin the way of the Kyuubi, who hadn't eased up on his glare one bit. Relax a bit, large, angry and destructive. I was just messing with you a bit. You know, I thought you'd have been used to this by now, but I guess not yet, huh? We can work on your not be provoked skills sometime soon, I am sure. Sending a quick pulse of chakra through his body, Naruto found that he was sitting back in the very small stone room that was just barely tall enough for him to sit in as a man of average, if not slightly above average height. In front of the raven-haired crow summoner was a piece of stone he had to work out by using the minimum amount of chakra to manipulating the wind to cut a blade-like section out of the rock. Anyway, since you asked what I was going to do, I'll tell you. I am going to create a blood seal that should negate and overpower the Tenro seal, but there is also a second part to this that is going to require your ability to heal damage. Back within the mindscape created from the seal, the Kyuubi rather casually lifted his brow because, as far as he knew from what he'd seen Naruto do with his seals, there was little to no damage coming back Naruto's way. Why would you need my help in healing something? I thought the reason for using the blood seal was to prevent you from having to manipulate the chakra while it was inside of you, thus preventing the Tenro from activating. That's what I thought, but I underestimated the amount of time it will take for my seal to fully remove Tenro. But the reason I need your help is because I believe this is the time that Mui is going to strike and try to use your chakra inside of me to open his box. Now, since I don't want to be taken out of the fight that will happen, I want to make a blood clone that will have the 3 tails of chakra from you it will need. Naruto admitted as he ran through the plan he had to go about tricking Mui and being able to fight for the box if the need arose, which he thought it would. The Kyuubi's crimson eyes glared ahead so far forward that one would think that a volcano had just erupted and wiped out his home, but he remained silent, leaving Naruto to wait for an answer from his tenant. The 9-tailed fox just got his 7th tail fully, and having to lose 3 of his tails for good was a harsh ask, but the fox wasn't an idiot. No, he knew fully well just how much of a problem that the Satori could be should it have the reign to do what it wanted, which in the end was the deciding factor. Fine, I'll do it. Thank you, but before we get to that, I need to offset this seal. Naruto murmured mentally as he took his trench coat covered by the resistant feathers of Shokai, his boss summon, leaving his upper body bare, showing the Tenro seal which formed an X shape around his chest, with the actual seal being in the center of that shape. Taking that stone dagger in front of him, the Uzumaki clan head sliced across his right palm, a wound that was not regenerated by the Kyuubi, since he knew it was necessary. Letting the blood drip from his fresh cut for a moment, Naruto quickly turned his palm up, letting the pool gather in his hand before dabbing the fingertip of his pointer finger into the blood ink. Closing his eyes, Naruto took a quick breath before his hand went about drawing out the seal with a certainty that showed hours upon hours of practice. His starting point was the space between his pectoral muscles, where he started to draw a rectangle across his chest with one section of the bottom line missing. Within that rectangular shape, there was a seal drawn with a remarkable likeness to that of the 8-trigram seal that was layered on the seals of his sisters, aside from the fact that instead of having smooth lines, the corners of it were sharp. After that was done, he quickly made an identical box just below the seal on his stomach, aside from the fact that where the section missing was not below but on top. Dipping his finger back into the blood, Naruto took the open spot in the first box and slowly started to create a rectangular path that turned left and right randomly down his body before the rectangular, labyrinth-like path ended at the top of the Tenro seal between the extensions on the corners of Tenro. Once that was done, he did the same from the top of the rectangle on his abdomen. He turned the path left and right, making sure that it went around the seal of the QB before it eventually connected to the bottom of the Tenro. The seal itself was finished. You may have a seal meant to stop the ordinary man, but I am an Uzumaki, we are seal innovators, and no mortal man or creature can match our chakra's strength, Naruto said with a wicked smirk as he wrote the matching symbol on his chest on both of his palms just before he clapped his hands together and closed his eyes, hands laced together in front of his face. Uzumaki-style seal. Blood seal. Seal negation. The red blood that dried atop of Naruto's chest glowed a faint orange before the color of the blood dropped into a deep black that filled the rectangle completely before that black pool of power started to drain out of the rectangles at the same pace as they traveled through the paths Naruto had drawn on his chest. Slowly, the surge of black made its way towards the center of his chest where the seal of the Tenro was located on his body. And finally that path of black hit the seal at the same time and began to swallow it, slowly purging it from Naruto's person starting right at its core. Okay, step 1 is finished. Naruto muttered with a sigh before he reached to his side and threw his trench coat back over his body, covering what was happening on his chest. And one more step to go. Are you ready, QB, to give your chakra to the clone? My chakra will sustain its form and yours will be its power, Naruto asked with a soft sigh as he cut himself open on the hand again, letting the blood form a pool on the floor in front of him. This better work, Naruto. His simple statement was all Naruto needed to hear to be informed that he was willing to go along with the plan, which honestly was a rather important part of this whole thing working. The sentiment that the QB hoped for was a feeling mutually held by Naruto, who was looking at his reflection in the surface of blood. I do too, because if not, then this thing will just continue to get stronger, and I doubt that anyone could stop it then, Naruto whispered before he started to focus his chakra, which forced a burn to travel through his body, but Naruto shoved that pain down and made use of the chakra he gathered. Ninja art. Blood clone. The chakra quickly traveled down his leg as Naruto stomped the puddle, kicking it into the air, but instead of falling to the floor with a splash, the chakra started to give it the shape of Naruto's body as the original fell to the ground, gasping as the burning started to take place, but it was lessening with each passing second. Panting once the QB repaired the damage done to Naruto's body, the black-haired shinobi stood up and placed his palm on his clone's head and allowed for the QB to slowly channel his energy into the clone. Slow enough so that the burst couldn't be felt, and when it was done he sat back down with a sigh, rubbing his brow. And now we wait. Naruto knew he had one more day left in solitary, as it was called, so he had some time to burn, but he was sure that his plan to get them would work, which involved him casting a quick, subtle genjutsu on the clone to make sure the seal appeared untampered with. A day and a half later, standing in front of an operating table down in the sub-basement beneath of Hozuki Castle was Mui and a group of his contemporaries, each of which were wearing a mask, but despite the fact their faces were covered, it was clear that every person creating the tight circle was looking at the body that was stirred out on the operating table. It was a person that Mui had become rather acquainted with over the past few days in Naruto Uchiha. Casting a slight shadow over the group was a strange wall with an even stranger face jutting out of the flat surface. In fact, it wasn't just a wall but an outer face of the box of ultimate bliss. How exactly did you manage to detain Naruto Uchiha without even getting a scratch or putting one on him? It was difficult to tell just what the gender of the person under the cloak and behind the mask because of the way it distorted the voice, but one thing that could not be mistaken was the amount of skepticism in that voice. From the way every other head turned to look at Mui, it seemed like a popular question that someone was waiting to voice. Mui didn't answer them immediately. Instead, he remained silent, staring down into the unconscious form of Naruto before he sighed and looked to the one who asked the question with a flat stare. I sentenced him to 3 days in solitary confinement where he wasn't given a single meal during his stay. Without any kind of nourishment, his body shut down. There was no need for me to even raise a hand when I could just outlast him in a battle he could not win. There were a few mumblings between the people gathered around the table, some believing that the tactic was actually quite clever, where there were a few more people that were more old school in their beliefs that it was rather cowardly of the warden. It matters not what the methods used were, all that matters is that we have what we need. Mui, release the seal, so we can begin the process of opening the box. To Mui, there was no need to acknowledge that obvious statement. This here was a moment he had been waiting decades for, the moment for him to reclaim his son and right one of, if not his greatest wrong. Walking 4 steps forward, Mui stopped beside Naruto and pulled open his trench coat and stared down at the Tenro seal on his face with a frown. He kept that expression for a few moments before he let a smile filled with hope shine through. Closing his eyes and furrowing his brow, the warden of the prison let his chakra go in one heavy burst as those around him attached the few bands and devices around Naruto that they needed to extract his chakra. The masked individual at the head of the table gave one last look over everything from the way Naruto's body was prepared to the machinery that everything was going to rely on one last time before he gave the nod to pull the lever and start the process, which the person at the lever did, causing the lights on the machine to illuminate and alternate back and forth between available spaces before a hum started to resonate through the machines. Naruto's body convulsed upwards and into the restraints they had fastened around him to keep him in place as the machinery went about starting to extract the latent chakra inside of Naruto's blood clone. It took the man-made technology a few more moments before it was able to pull out a vibrant cloak of orange that bubbled as it remained its structure around Naruto's body, with 3 flailing tails whipping out around him, nearly hitting a few masked members, which caused them to jump back to avoid being batted aside by the manifested chakra clinging to Naruto's body. What is the meaning of this? The muffled nature of the voice behind yet another one of the masked people did not help the fact that the voice sounded panicked at what they were seeing. The person had even fall onto their back, leaving them to resort to looking up at the wildly flailing tails that cut through the air with enough force that the sound was audible. That's the power of the Kyubi no Yoko. Even Mui's usually steady voice was momentarily shaken before he smirked and watched as the orange, unruly chakra slowly being sucked away from Naruto's unconscious body. It seemed he had stumbled upon the not-so-metaphorical jackpot in the form of Naruto Uchiha, because now he watched the machinery doing its work and transferring the energy into the box. With an expression nearing that of glee as he watched the orange chakra being sucked into the beak-like mouth on the box. There was a moment of nothing before the eyes on the ace lit up and the box started to spin like a drill. Carving through the stone like a hot knife through butter, without any further assistance, the box of ultimate shot up through the stone and foundation above it, maintaining the same spinning rotation as it fired upward towards the surface, causing the secretive group, who wanted to open the box, to shout urgings of urgency before they followed the box, to finally get their wish of a true Kusagakure. In their rush to see their dreams finally coming true, they all failed to notice that Naruto's body had turned into nothing more than a puddle of blood that was dropping down the sides of the table and into the cracks on the stone floor down below the table. There was one thing for certain, however, and that was the box of ultimate bliss had been officially opened, and the world in its entirety was now under threat by one of the greatest evils known to those even before the time of Shinobi. Back in the courtyard of the prison, what could be seen happening was absolute chaos. From the moment that the box had made its presence known, prisoners started to panic due to the fact that some of the earth below their feet became a sinkhole, and even on the top corner of the box there was a body that had been impaled by a corner of the box, letting a series rivet of blood to flow down the face of the box right between the eyes. Screaming could be heard from those who weren't frozen in place, as some took this as a chance to fight the guards, who were equally astonished, to gain their freedom, or at least the tools to better ensure the freedom they sought. This was the scene that Ryuzetsu, who was standing off to the side away from the chaos, watched with wide, fearful eyes. Not fear from the prisoners who were attempting to run roughshod over the place, but from the fact that the box of her nightmares stood there in the center of the pandemonium, which was enough to show a small microcosm of what could happen to the rest of the world if the box was not contained here and now in Hozuki Castle. That, however, was not the only obvious but clearly important revelation that she made. The other one being the fact that to open the box of ultimate bliss meant that Naruto had somehow fallen into the clutches of Mui and his group. Great! I told him that his plan was going to get people killed, and better yet, he isn't even in any position to help me wherever he is. Ryuzetsu hissed to herself in irritation as she watched Mui being shadowed by some cloaked, masked individuals who all used the hectic environment to get to the box untouched and unnoticed. Knowing there was nothing she could do now, the white-haired Kunoichi contented herself with waiting until the moment was right. There it is, the box of ultimate bliss. My dreams and hopes have led up to this point, and here it is. The feeling is invigorating. Mui mumbled to himself as he could almost feel his blood running red with excitement. He didn't even care to mention the group that helped him get to this point, showing just how enthralled with the opportunity he had in front of him. Images, no more like flashes of his dreams, filled his vision as he peered unafraid into the glowing eyes of the box that was told to grant dreams to the who opened it, namely Mui. From behind him, the older, more power-hungry members of his group approached from behind him, mostly talking to themselves, but there was one person in particular who stepped right behind Mui and placed their hand on his shoulder, a smile on the old, crinkled face behind the mask. It was a day of glee and a day of fruition, but perhaps most important of all, it was a day meant for celebration. Go on, Mui. Go on and tell the box to restore Kusa to the previous glory, that it was so we may take our rightful place in the world. Shrugging the hand on his shoulder off, Mui walked forward towards the box with the utmost confidence in his posture. He even continued on as some of the ground around him gave way in places so frantic it didn't even have anything resembling a pattern. Once he was left in front of the box, he looked up and merely brushed his long hair out of his face, waiting and ready to give the box his deepest desire, his wish. However, before anyone could say anything more, a voice that seemed like it was laced in the wind itself carried through the area, freezing many cold as they all looked around for the voice, except for Mui. What is it that you want most of all? What is it you want to wish for? I want you to bring my son back to me. Bring Muku back to me from death. The warden was quick with his demand, causing everyone who was listening to what he said look at his back with eyes wide as possible. To his group of cohorts, this request came out of left field, since it had been, and always was, clearly established that the goal of this undertaking was to make sure that their village came back to the glory and strength it once held. Ryuzetsu too held the firm expression of shock as her best friend's father wished for his resurrection, which left her filled with both hope and dread all at once. Mui, what do you think you're doing? This isn't what we agreed on, to waste the wish on bringing back your boy, who couldn't even bring the box to open in the first place. Have you lost your damned mind? The moment I lost my son was the moment that Kusa was lost to me for good. Now all I want is Muku back, and that's what I'll get from this box. Mui stated matter-of-factly, not even caring to hear the cursing come from his back. Before the masked group could even think on possibly retaliating on Mui for betraying them, there was something that caught everyone's attention, and that was that the light in the box's eyes faded before the wall facing the group fell to the ground with a loud, resounding thud. Despite that, any number of eyes stopped what they were doing and turned to try and steal a glance of what was in the box. There seemed to be an impenetrable shadow that shrouded any light from filling the box and showing what was there in it. That was the way things remained for the following few minutes, until finally the sound of footsteps broke the terse silence that settled in the immediate area. At first the sound of the walking was quiet and seemed to be miles away from those around the box, but a few moments later the steps echoing in the box got much closer. What came out of the box shocked those watching, because instead of some earth-shaking presence that no matter what had to be acknowledged, out came a young man who looked no older than 15 maybe. His hair, while straight, went no further down his body than about halfway down the back and sides of his neck. His ordinary clothing was torn erratically, and on top of that he had dirty smudges rubbed along his pale flesh. This young man's name was Muku, son of Mui, and what no one seemed to be able to notice was the fact that his face was dead. Muku, my son. The amount of words was few, but the raw emotion coming from the father who was being reunited with his son was nearly infinite as he watched his boy continue to walk forward. Muku had even made it a full 5 steps before Mui, elated by seeing his son, rushed forward and wrapped his son in a tight, welcoming embrace. His chin rested on Muku's shoulder as a lone tear rolled from his tightly scrunched eyes, memories of a time with his wife and expected son filling his once cold heart with a nearly forgotten kind of warmth. Father! Muku's voice was quiet, but in this moment in his life it was the only thing that Mui could even think to hear. Lifting his arms after being still, Mui believed that his son may have finally snapped out of his daze and was moving to return their long-awaited father-son moment. It was that belief that led him to drop his guard. Instead of responding with a hug, Muku responded by driving his hand clean through his father's torso like a dagger. Gasping, Mui's eyes opened his eyes, alarmed and betrayed, as blood slowly started to leak from the left corner of his lips. He could already feel himself losing consciousness, his sight going bleary and those calling his name from behind sounding like a million miles away. Opening his mouth, Mui tried to ask why, but the only thing that came out was wet cough that threw blood up on the ground over his son's shoulder. Your son was gone the moment you sacrificed him to me. With an amount of strength that none had been expecting from a young man of his stature, Muku lifted his arm, taking Mui off of his feet before tossing his arm to the side, throwing the man responsible for his life callously to the side, where he went skidding along the tiled roof, kicking up a path of destruction in his wake. Your son no longer exists in this world. He has been twisted, corrupted by the influence of the inescapable prison that the box is. He is nothing more than a shadow of himself, an avatar to give my birth, to fuel the rise of the Satori. No longer was it the voice of any normal human coming out of the boy's body. Now the voice speaking seemed to be lashing out against anything within hearing distance with a victorious kind of gloating that inspired a certain amount of dread to those around. Everything went quiet for a moment before abruptly out of his shoulder blades came forth a jutting, misformed pair of wings that were black and laced with feathers. It was enough to see that, but then his entire body went through grotesque transformation into the eyeless, crudely shaped form of Satori. It was a transformation that caused a few nearby to lurch forward and empty their stomachs. The mouth in the center of the headless torso opened up just enough that dark vapor trails lingered out of its mouth and into the air while Satori's body moved left to right as it scanned the area for a few moments before it stopped where it was looking originally, even though it didn't have a pair of eyes to see with. Hypersensitized by fear, one of the individuals in the mask and shroud realized that all was lost and moved to run for his life, but before he could make any meaningful progress, Satori had captured the runaway in his hand. Raising the terrified human to where its mouth was Satori's mouth, contorted into a menacing grin that could have terrified even the most seasoned of shinobi. Not a word was needed on the behalf of the Avatar of Enlightenment to cause the fearful human's blood to run cold. All that was necessary was that terrifying aura that Satori produced in abundance. The man who was actually under that mask didn't even get a chance to beg before the Satori turned and literally threw him into the box where his screams echoed out of akin to that of someone being thrown down a ravine. Revenge in this moment overpowered the paralysis induced by fear as the man's fellow companions saw red at losing one of their own. Each individual let loose one of their battle cries while bringing forth their own obscure weapons, each leaping at Satori foolishly. It was a mistake that proved nearly fatal, as all the demonic creature needed to do was lash its arm out, sending a large blade-like wave of wind and them cutting them all but not killing them. Their masks shattered and falling around them, the beast didn't even allow them to fall to the ground as it went around them and sent a flap of its wings at them, the powerful gust being more than enough to send their collective bodies spiraling into the box. "Muku, what are you doing? Stop, Muku!" Ryuzetsu shouted, asking desperately just what was going through her best friend's mind. She even cupped her hands around her mouth to try and make her voice louder. Right now, where everyone saw a monster of absolute chaos, the white-haired woman saw her best friend, who she was determined to get back. She was about ready to run towards Satori when an arm in front of her stopped her before she could even take so much as a step forward. The arm belonged to Marwa, a supposed agent of Mui. "Listen, I don't know who you think that is, but that's not who he is anymore. If you rush out there and try to talk sense into him, you're liable to end up like those elders who thought that rushing Satori was a good idea." Marwa told her the harsh truth while watching as the monster cornered a group of fearful prisoners, who stood no chance as it brutalized them to a state of near death, only for them to be piled up and tossed into the box, further fueling the evil lingering in that box. Ryuzetsu, who was watching the same thing play out with a detached expression, turned to Marwa and gave him the deadliest glare that her eyes could manage. Even if she knew the dangers of Satori, and she did, that didn't mean she couldn't try and help her old friend. She couldn't forsake him because of fear. "What else can I do? I can sit back and do nothing while he needs my help," she shouted passionately at him, her face scrunching further into the glare that was already there on her face. "Unfortunately, the only thing that's left to do is destroy the monster that is Satori," Marwa muttered before he stepped out of the underhang and lifted his hand into the air towards the bleary sky above. It was almost an immediate transition from the warmth near the buildings to the whipping, cool air that lashed against his bared chest, but that wouldn't distract him from performing his task. "Raitun, Denko Naroshi, lightning release, lightning signal fire." Satori stopped its collecting when the blast of lightning shot from ground level high into sky, ripping through the thin layer of cloud cover. The constant stream of lightning acting as a beacon, causing the monster to tilt its upper body back as it stared high into the sky, wondering just what was going on. At least that was until it noticed a massive shadow coming down on top of it. Not one to stay still and allow itself to be crushed, Satori effortlessly glided off to the left just as out of the sky fell the eight-tailed ox, whose white eyes peered right into the face of Satori just as a small squadron of cloud shinobi fell in behind him. The group of shinobi consisted of the Jounins, Darui, Shur, Samui, and Yujito, while behind them were the Chunins, Omoi, Karui, and a recently promoted Nabui, sister of the rakeage assistant who wanted more than a desk job. Marwa smiled seeing his friends, but he knew so long that the Tenro seal was still in play that he wouldn't be able to do much more than watch their plot to destroy the box finally come to fruition. Yo, monster man, your breath stinks. Really wants to knock me to the brink. The poorly crafted rap came from the mouth of the Hachibi, which was the signal to show that it was in fact Killer B who was in control of this complete transformation. But the only person who visibly broke from the serious stare that was being sent the enlightened being's way was from Gyuki back inside of B's mindscape, but for the sake of the situation he remained silent so that B could focus. B continued to stare at the beast expecting some kind of response, but when it was clear he wouldn't be getting one he readied for combat. Closing the distance between the two, B was quick to throw a left-right combination of fists that considering the size he was came at a rather quick, abrupt pace, but it proved ineffective against Satori as it simply gilded right then left countering the strikes and not letting them even come close to making contact. Seeing that his melee attacks were not doing the trick and knowing that against an opponent like this that time was not his ally, B tried using his tails, using 4 of them as staggered whips that he tried to use against Satori, but again and again, whether it was moving to the side, ducking, or kicking into the air, the creature from the box of ultimate bliss was able to dodge his attacks with ease. For the first time in ages, the man who was considered the second strongest cloud shinobi, if not the first, felt irritation building up in him as he could not hit his opponent, a feeling he had not experienced since he was a young child. Growling slightly, B overextended a wild punch that Satori slid underneath of, allowing for it to shoulder ram B into a prison building, causing the structure to start and fall on top of him. Seeing the front line offensive down for the moment, Samui and Darui shared a quick nod before they stepped up near each other, hands forming the same signs before they pointed their hands Satori's direction. Rantun, Ryza Sakasu, Storm Release, Laser Circus. From both of their hands shot out a grid of bright laser beams that fired off in random directions, crossing left, right, and sideways before the numerous amounts of blinding beams converged on the same point, creating a small explosion of dirt and dust. Slowly, Samui and Darui let their hands and arms fall into a more neutral position, while Karui pumped her fist from behind them. See, that thing wasn't so tough. Samui and Darui were able to take care of it just like that. No, Karui, we weren't quite that lucky, came the calming, intense voice of Yujito from behind her, who had grown over the past few years it had taken for her to master control of her Biju. Before, where she was a bit shy, she was now much more confident after getting a few accomplishments under her belt. Karui, who didn't quite understand what she meant, turned towards Yujito with a confused look on her face. That was until she was motioned to turn around, where she found that Satori was descending back towards the ground unscathed. Clicking her tongue against her teeth, Yujito turned her head to the side, causing her ponytail to follow up behind her, her slitted blue eyes leveled on Shur, a young jounin with blonde hair and pale skin. He was a jounin and sensory/medic nin. Shur, what did you sense? Did that thing teleport or something? It was the only thing that made sense to her. After all, how often did anyone avoid a tangled web of high-speed laser beams being fired around them without so much as a singe mark on the flesh? Shur, who was silently absorbing the battle through his sensory capabilities, opened his eyes to respond to the two tails Jinchuriki. Shaking his head, the young man released a breath he had been holding during the short skirmish between his fellow jounin and the yokai creature. No, it wasn't any kind of teleportation. It dodged every single attack. The creature shows a surprising amount of agility considering how fragile its spine seems to be. I'm not sure how, but that's what happened. Darui sighed and let his hand reach back to take the massive sword he carried around off just in case the need arose. Rubbing his palm at his forehead at the front line of his white hair, Darui shot Shur a glance from over his shoulder. Shur, find a way to cut him off from the rest of the world so we can hit him. Got it? Darui asked with a serious look on his usually aloof face, causing Shur to truly realize just what kind of danger they were in. He had been on missions before with Darui where he never looked any more serious than that of a sleeping man or woman. Shur nodded his head, understanding what was needed of him, but he knew his limitations were, and the fact that the monster was currently lifting one of its clawed hands up, probably intending on bringing it down on their positions. All right, but I am going to need some time. Time he doesn't want to give us, Shur shouted so that his voice could reach everyone as he pointed to what Darui had not seen looking back at him. Don't worry, Shur. Just focus on getting your jutsu ready, Yujito commanded as she ran ahead of Shur, Omoi, and Karui, but behind Darui and Samui. performing hand seals as her eyes refused to leave Satoru's falling claw. Rearing her torso and head back, Yujito called forth her fire affinity and channeled it through her lungs and throat before her mouth opened. Katan, Nazumi Kedama, fire release, mouse hairball. Launched from her mouth came a trio of shadowy, mouse-shaped projectiles surrounded in a shroud of blue flames that were unique to the Jinchuriki of the two-tailed monster cat. Aiming for the claw, her attacks forced the demon to recall his hand, lest it allowed for her attacks to burn and possibly set its hand on fire. Its flimsy legs tensed before it shot itself into the air, just as one of B's tails tried to loop around its waist, but with the creature taking to the air, his attempted sneak attack failed. Snarling slightly, the head of the Ushioni tilted upward, staring down the Satori as it hovered high above B and the eight tails. Its wings pointing downward to the ground B was occupying. It flapped its wings a few times, sending a hail of feathers towards B, the quill tips cutting through the air like hundreds of miniature daggers, honing in on that exact location. Not wanting to be turned into a pincushion, the brother of the Rakage lifted his arms and used the iron hide of the eight tails to deflect the feathers with his forearms, sending the projectiles scattering off harmless. No longer taking the defensive stance in this fight, the Satora dive bombed B's position and skewed the talons on the ends of its feet in B's guard, penetrating the hide and drawing blood, causing B to grunt through the manifestation of the eight tails. Hissing slightly, B put all his energy into throwing the Satori off of him, causing the creature's claws to rip further along his flesh before it was sent sailing back towards the very box that it had emerged from. But instead of colliding with the box of myth, the demon gracefully righted itself before perching atop the box, its body positioned to face the group of shinobi, leaving B facing its back, the end result being Satori coming out victorious on this exchange. Megan, Rengo Kushitsu, demonic illusion, purgatory chamber. Sure shouted as he expelled all the chakra he could manage to try and trap the beast in what seemed to be an endless chamber of white. This was a technique much like the Bringer of Darkness, only it had the added effect of leaving the target floating and tumbling, disorienting them as well as isolating the target. But where the technique was the most adverse was in the amount chakra it took for Sure to use, often leaving him out of the fight for a good bit after this. There, it's done, he panted out with a heavy sigh. That's our cue. Come on, Omoi. We have to get those wings while we have the chance. Karui called out, getting a right from the lollipop-eating swordsman before both drew their finely crafted blades and charged right for the beast on the box. The closer the two got, the more confident they were that this was the time that a blow was finally landed on Satori. Channeling chakra into the soles of their feet, both launched themselves at the creature in tandem, with lightning chakra surging through their swords, ready to render its wings useless. Stabbing forward, Karui's amber eyes drilled holes into the creature's headless body before she and Omoi lunged forward. Eat this! The static-covered tips of their blades were mere inches away from the body of the creature before the yokai did something none of them expected and laughed. It was a hollow, chill-creating laugh that made the two Chunin freeze for a moment just before the Satori lashed out with its wings, creating a violent surge of wind that threw the airborne shinobi backwards violently. Luckily for Karui, Yujito was following behind them and managed to catch her, sending both Kunoichi sliding backwards, but Omoi wasn't as lucky and collided harshly with a column nearby that knocked both his breath and some blood out of his mouth. Tasting his blood around the candy that was in his mouth, Omoi groaned and spat out the candy so he could focus more on his breathing. Grunting, his body protested, but despite that, Omoi used his sword to prop himself back up to a somewhat ready position just as Sure ran over to him to make sure that the younger shinobi was alright. So it looks like genjutsu won't work on that thing, huh? Omoi asked as he ridded his mouth of the last lingering tastes of blood in his mouth. Now B, Darui shouted from where he was crouched on top of one the eight tails. Nodding, B started to spin slowly before he threw the tail. Darui was perched on top of, sending the right-hand man of the Rakage high into the air behind the Satori, who was staring down the assembled group of Cloud Ninja who were in front of it. Of course, the shinobi group saw Darui going upwards and held their ground, waiting for the eventual descent, taking the role of decoy. It wasn't even an entire minute later when Darui came crashing down with a spinning blow aimed towards the center of Satoru's body. But just like every other time they launched an attack, Satora simply moved out of the way and perched itself on top of one of the castle's walls just as Darui's blade came slashing down, hitting against the box, but the momentum that came to an abrupt and completely caused Darui's blade to fly back, ripping it from his grip and sending the blade off to the side, leaving a frowning Darui who was rubbing at his wrists, sore from the sudden jostling. Samui, who was watching all this happen while standing guard over Shur and Omoy while a medical check was insisted on by Shur, frowned, seeing yet another failed multi-prong attempt have no success whatsoever. "This is really not cool," she muttered, marching over to where Darui's blade fell, picking it up with the aid of her chakra, and tossed it back to the man, getting a quick thank you. "Follow my lead. Go in with speed," be advised before he rushed forward with his tails following in first, all 8 of which were directed in stabbing forth at 8 different angles. Normally he'd come up with some kind of plan with the Hachibi's guidance, but even the 8-tailed Biju was stunned and unsure of what to do against the Satori, who showed the ability to evade and pierce his iron hide should it actually try to do so. Again, however, the demon creature glided in and out of each attack, leaving the tails of the 8 tails to puncture through the walls of another building. But when B tried to pull his tails out of it, he found that each and every one of them were stuck in place. Floating back down into place behind B, Satoru's misplaced mouth twisted into a sickening grin before it lifted its talons outward, so they were aimed directly at the back of an immobilized Cloud Jinchuriki. Lunging forward, both Satori and B disappeared as Satori drove them both back into the building, causing the rubble to collapse inward in a massive pile of destruction that swallowed both titans in size, leaving the battlefield to fall into an eerie silence that was only occasionally broken by a fierce gale blowing by. "B-sensei?" Karui screamed, the worry evident in her voice after watching her sensei disappear from sight alone with that monster that should only be seen in nightmares. Being one of his 3 students, it was only natural that Karui believed that Killer B was even stronger than their Reikage, which made the fact that he was being handled so easily by the Satori all the more jarring. It was a sentiment shared by Omoy, Yujito, and Samui, each of whom had been trained by the 8 Tails Jinchuriki. There was a slight shuffle within the confines of the rubble pile that brought a glimmer of hope to the younger shinobi, hoping, almost expecting to see the guardian of Kumogakure to emerge victorious like he had always done. However, that hope was dashed once that same cruel laughter that brought goosebumps to even Darui's skin echoed out across the courtyard as Satori emerged once more without a scratch, 2 talons fulls of people in its grip. The face on the yokai curled into a smirk as it threw even more prisoners into the box that Darui was standing on, unable to do anything about it. "Yes, your fear tastes excellent, but I am tired of your constant opposition. I must destroy you," Satori mumbled out, its voice hollow and a near shriek that caused an involuntary shiver to travel down the spines of those who were around to listen. Moving on towards his box, Satori forced Darui to leap down and join his fellow shinobi. The sound of Satori's claws hitting against the metal below it was still fresh when the remaining closed walls of the box opened up and started to form a strong force of suction, causing the number of bodies that had been strewn about unconscious throughout the fight to be sucked into the box. Distracted by the number of bodies flying through the air, the Cloud Shinobi all recognized that there was a sudden build in demonic energy coming off of the Satori, who had opened its mouth and started to emanate a faint red glow from its mouth, leaving the shinobi a bit uneasy. Yujito, who was in the middle of the group, was the first to piece this together with Satori's only statement, which in turn had her first to act. Leaping in front of her allies, Yujito made contact with the Nibi. "Nibi, we have to go with that. It's the only shot we have against this thing. I hear what you're saying, Kitten, but we're not even sure what the capabilities of that are yet, and one thing for sure is that whatever Ugly over there is doing is that it won't be something to take lightly." The 2 Tails countered back with her own warning, not wanting to see her container being hurt when she possibly could avoid it by talking some sense into her, and in doing so hopefully deterring her from being the first line of defense. "It's the only thing that has a chance at saving us. We have to do this," Yujito implored of her tenant, getting a defeated sigh from the monster cat before the Biju relented and decided to go with her container's plan. The moment she and Nibi were ready to do what must be done, Satori suddenly turned to the left before its entire body went stiff and it hurriedly rocketed up high into the sky above the prison. Then just a moment later, a mass of black flames went racing across the space that Satori was just occupying and straight into one of the walls off to the side, the flames sticking to the wall and burning in place. "Wait, is that?" Shur asked, feeling much more on edge now that he recognized what he was looking at was the legendary black flames of Amaterasu, which were said to burn for 7 days and 7 nights. It was also the calling card of Itachi Uchiha, who personally none of the Cloud Shinobi wanted to see right now. An S-ranked missing Nin along with a creature they couldn't even scratch. Well, the odds were by no means in their favor right now. "Damn! I missed!" To the shock of those shinobi who were at the Chunin exams back at Konoha a few years ago, the person that suddenly appeared standing in front of Yujito was a shinobi with black hair, but what really revealed who it was to Yujito was the sense she got from him. "Naruto," she whispered, looking at him, shocked to see him again and shocked to see him here of all places. Hearing his name, the young man turned his head, letting Yujito see the new pattern of his Sharingan. The Mangekyo pattern of his eyes, zoning in on Yujito, catching her staring into the center of bladed flower design of his eyes.